if any organization is contending with a determined, well-funded adversary like a state-backed actor who has decided that you are the target they need, then I think breaches are still inevitable, given enough time and resources. And so there is always value in early detection and containment as the most viable strategy to address those.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative and Wiz is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership with one of the contributors to my latest book, the best-selling CISO Compass: Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, as well as from other top CISOs and security thought leaders. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC or visit cyberleadersunite.com.
So hi everybody, I'm Raaz, VP Product Strategy at Wiz, and joining me today is Ryan Kazanciyan, CISO at Wiz. So Ryan, how did you get into cybersecurity?
Yeah, so my interest started when I was really young. I was playing video games on my computer when I was like 10 or 11 and learning about like copy protection and how people got around that. And that sort of led me down this rabbit hole of like the early days of hacking and discovering, and I'm dating myself now, but like bulletin board systems that you could dial into with your modem. And that just spiraled into me discovering like text files and early issues of FRAC. And so reading up more and more about it. And when I went to college, I knew I wanted to be in computer science, at least as an undergraduate degree, but I really wanted a job when I came out of college that would let me somehow channel this like enthusiasm and energy for hacking in a legal and productive way. And so I wanted to do pen testing more than anything else. I ended up working at PricewaterhouseCoopers doing security advisory work, which included pen testing, but at first was a lot of like security audit support work. So that was my first toe into security and did eventually lead me into doing pen testing, app security, and then later in my career, incident response and lots of other facets. But yeah, it just started with this passion for hacking and the excitement of sort of seeing how to defeat security controls and put yourself in the mind of an attacker.
Very interesting. I definitely think like pen testing is almost the perfect way of getting into cybersecurity. What was like your key learning from your pen testing days? So I think when I was a pen tester, you get to the point where you feel like everything's hackable. And it's really fun and thrilling when you bypass a control and get access to the crown jewels that you're set out to go after. And then later in my career, I was an incident responder. That also was both really exciting because I sort of mind shifted from, okay, instead of being the adversary or a simulated adversary, now I'm going to think in their way and try to put together the breadcrumb trail of what they did when they compromised an organization, which was also super exciting. It also can lead to an almost sort of pessimism because after doing enough incident response, you start to feel like incident after incident that like security failures are just inevitable and there's just an endless sequence of them. And being hacked just starts to feel like an inevitability, which it isn't. Later in my career, I ended up working at vendors, spent time at Tanium. I spent time on a defense and security engineering role at Meta, and then once again at a vendor here at Wiz. And I think it's easy at a vendor to get swept up in the optimism of product-driven solutions as well, that the perfect cocktail of technologies could be this impenetrable shield for ages of security debt that an organization might build up. But I think that optimism is also valuable because it proves you can build solutions that help organizations make meaningful strides and sort of raise the bar for attackers. And so I try to keep that pessimism and optimism balanced so that I'm like grounded in reality and take the lessons learned from hands-on work dealing with both determined adversaries and opportunistic attackers to sort of inform how we approach building better security solutions. Very interesting. And I guess almost as a follow-up question to that, you've been in those roles where you've had firsthand insights into how adversaries operate and succeed and adapt for over 15 years now. What's been consistent across these generations of attacks? And what can we learn from that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's interesting how little things change in some regards. I mean, for one, I'd say that if any organization is contending with a determined, well-funded adversary like a state-backed actor who has decided that you are the target they need, then I think breaches are still inevitable given enough time and resources. And so there's always value in early detection and containment as the most viable strategy to address those. Now, the fortunate thing, though, is the vast majority of organizations may not find themselves in those crosshairs. And so I think for them, they instead have to typically just contend with a growing set of opportunistic attackers. And the nice thing about opportunistic attackers is they're rational economic actors. So one of the byproducts of that is like, it's better to be part of, as an opportunistic attacker, to be part of the late majority when adopting an attack technique, because it's expensive to be on the bleeding edge and stay there. And it also carries a higher failure rate. So like, as an example, way back in my career when I was doing incident response, I worked on the first wave of attacks where attackers in Windows environments operationalized PowerShell scripting as means of both abusing built-in features of the OS and also scripting and automating their way to various attack techniques that were not getting detected well. And the trajectory of those capabilities being available to attackers to them actually being used at a meaningful, measurable scale was measured in many, many years. It took almost 4 or 5 years before it went from possible to commonplace. And I've seen that sort of similar arc with other attack techniques like attacking weak two-factor authentication. And the benefit of those long arcs is it does give defenders and organizations more time to respond to emerging attacks than we may often realize or internalize. And so we tend to undervalue that the bigger problems with security controls are not that they're keeping up with the bleeding edge. It's that they're not always implemented completely and comprehensively and not monitored effectively. And if you do those things, I think we have a better shot at keeping up with the attackers because, again, they are not always staying at the bleeding edge.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think for me also, some Army background, what you've said is, of course, like absolutely true. Like if a nation state is targeting you, then your focus should be on fast detection. But just like you said, for most organizations, that's not reality. I mean, for most organizations, reality is actually like sticking hard to the baselines and kind of making sure that you're avoiding all of the easy hits of like scanners and accidental exposures. And those are definitely things where we can be optimistic about it because just like you said, attackers, they start where it's easy. And that's like a short list of things that organizations can pay like extra attention to. And I think like goes a very, very long way in reducing your chances of somebody actually managing a breach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I think you've mentioned MFA there, which is definitely a hot topic, right? Like in this year, in 2022, there were numerous high-profile incidents where attackers successfully compromised despite multiple forms of like MFA authentication. Are we at a tipping point? I mean, what do you think comes next? Do you think organizations are going to move to passwordless? How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting example where we've known as an industry that methods of 2FA like SMS or time-based codes were not at a like first principles basis fully secure, but they were still enough of an improvement of the old status quo of just username and password to mitigate password spraying and brute forcing and other attacks that were just wrecking organizations. And so what I think ended up happening is finally adoption of some 2FA methods, not necessarily ideal ones, but at least some, reached critical mass, and I think did have the intended effect in mitigating some of those attacks, but also created the incentive for attackers to finally shift from targeted attacks where they bypass these techniques in a sort of ad hoc way to basically building the crimeware toolkits to commoditize two-factor authentication, phishing, and replay, as well as creative things like going after the supply chain of communications companies that support things like SMS messaging to businesses. And so I think that was the tipping point and leads us here where, fortunately, the good news is we have better alternatives. We have FIDO2 authentication. We have secure hardware authenticators, not just supported by all major operating systems, but relatively inexpensive for businesses to procure. And for individuals, like if you have an iPhone, for example, you have a FIDO2 authenticator in your pocket. You've got the underlying trusted hardware module on the device to support that. Same for Windows Hello. So the availability of the technology is great. Now we need to fight this long tail of incompatible applications that don't yet support it and figure out how to solve for both accessibility, like making sure it's available for users of all backgrounds and capabilities to adopt, and also recovery, meaning like making sure that you can actually securely support an employee who lost their hardware authenticator and needs to log in, that people don't get locked out, that you don't create new security vulnerabilities by creating recovery workflows that are easily bypassed, because that's what attackers will go for. So these are all like solvable problems, but it does mean that it's going to take time. And so we're going to see that similar sort of slow adoption curve because of the long tail of issues that impede full adoption. And that is going to provide a window for attackers to continue to succeed in the interim.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it's just been interesting, just like you said, like once something becomes almost like a commodity security practice, then there's like a lag, but then there will always kind of come attacks. So it's always about also like staying ahead. And I do also think like the attacks we've seen this year with the MFA also kind of show the importance of like you can have measures, you can have security measures and tools, but it's also so much about people. Like also, I feel like extra education around MFA and around being like very vigilant on multiple attempts could have also potentially have gone like a long way in some of the breaches we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, access is also important too. Like I had read a recent article about Google's recent move to force two-factor authentication for all Gmail accounts, leaving a large number of elderly users unable to successfully authenticate because they lost or didn't know what phone number they had associated with the account. And so that is one of many examples where as we think about a new security control, we also have to think really hard about usability and impact to people of all different types. Because if a control can't be adopted and used universally by everyone, then people end up creating workarounds and those create gaps.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers.
Absolutely. Such a great point. And as we kind of move, as we look forward, what type of leading indicators do you think suggest the types of attacks organizations should prepare for? What type of emerging threats we saw this year that maybe aren't being talked about enough, but you think will be impactful?
So one that I think is really interesting and people are only just scratching the surface on understanding and discussing is various approaches for lateral movement between and among corporate development and cloud production infrastructure. I think we're in the earliest days of just getting our arms around identity risk, trusts, and access paths. And the complexity is just on orders of magnitude greater than what organizations had to previously contend with when you might have just a simple internal Windows Active Directory and then maybe like an LDAP server supporting your Unix servers and your production environment, and that was it. Now there's so much more in terms of automated service accounts, in terms of trusts, in terms of identity providers that are linking both corporate and development and production environments with just a sprawl of roles in both user and automated contexts. And so just mapping these all out is still challenging for many organizations. And then even once you've got a reasonable inventory of it, ascertaining what are the viable attack paths where someone could gain a foothold in, say, a dev environment and leverage that to access things they shouldn't, or gain a foothold in a corporate endpoint and use it to access a production resource that they shouldn't. It's really hard for many organizations to identify and prioritize how to contain those attack paths. And so I think that's an area where we're going to see a lot of continued compromises in attack activity and a lot of work from the security community to try to find better ways to help organizations contain that. I think the second I'd say is lack of effective isolation in multi-tenancy cloud environments. I think this is an area Wiz's research team has been finding and releasing a lot of really interesting bugs, like earlier this year in Postgres as implemented by many cloud service providers. And it's an instantiation of a common design pattern that, building services that were potentially originally created for single tenancy contexts and then deploying and using them in multi-tenancy contexts is really, really complicated. And whenever there is a failure in any component of that stack, understanding what isolation exists and how to prevent attackers from accessing other organizations' data or moving from a small foothold in one compromised service to a broader set of resources that are intended for other organizations in a multi-tenancy environment is still, I think, a new area of exploration for bug hunters. And for businesses, potentially upends the threat model where, a lot of assumptions that were made about where security controls need to sit and what the cloud service provider should be doing may need to be revisited, or at least drive a need for some more transparency from the cloud service providers to describe where isolation does and does not occur.
I couldn't agree more. What's interesting is both of the problems you've raised are really huge challenges, right? Like taking the first problem you've mentioned around building, at essence, like good isolation between even your development environments. I've often had conversations with different security teams at great companies and great security teams where, almost the basics of, what we now call the basics, right? Of making sure to separate your accounts even, right? Like not mix production and dev in an account or in a namespace, or even those, what is now kind of considered basics. Oftentimes organizations are at a situation where, their services were already built in a certain way. And going almost backwards from that, it can be very, very hard. What would you advise situations in this state? And I think this is something CISOs and security teams often have to face, right? Like you come into an organization and there's certain things that are just built in a certain way, which makes isolation very hard. How would you approach this?
Yeah, I think it comes down to prioritization. Like you nailed it. You can't just burn down everything that was built in the last 10 or 20 years or however long an organization has been iterating on its technology stack and like refactor it all for what would be ideal in a current state. And so, yeah, that does lead to a lot of complexity. I look at organizations with sort of hybrid on-prem and cloud directory structures and mixes of cloud hosted and local development environments. And it's almost impossible to perfectly segregate anything when you're trying to migrate from that to potentially like a pure like cloud only infrastructure. And so I think it comes down to prioritization. Like there's always going to be a not infinite, but extremely large number of potential attack paths where given access to a particular resource, like given an attacker with remote code execution on an end user device or on a development instance or on a production service, like where can they go? I think the thing that can help organizations is when they're threat modeling their most critical services to think about exposure and also take threat intelligence as a flavor to add on top of what they're doing. What I've seen is a lot of organizations threat model and come up with the theoretical attack paths, but then struggle with prioritization. One of the many ways that you can help prioritize attack paths and then focus your controls is to like have that intelligence overlay and understanding like what are the most likely exploitable toxic combinations that lead to an attacker having a viable path from an untrusted to a trusted resource, or based on prior intelligence and prior attacker activity, like things that are well operationalized by attackers. What do we know from past incidents that can inform the attack paths we should focus on closing first? A lot of times, like those types of discussions or tooling to support those types of discussions isn't a part of how threat modeling gets done, if it's done at all. And so I think bringing in the tooling and intelligence to support those types of decisions can help with prioritization quite a bit.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I do think it's a core challenge. Like you said, there's also just reality and knowing kind of where do we go from a specific reality for a service or a product you're protecting. Moving on to a bit of a different but related subject. It's been over a year since the Biden administration cybersecurity executive order and the mandates around SBOM. And those have remained among the top discussion points in the industry. I wonder what's your take on how the industry is approaching this problem and the impact it's having?
So as CISO of a company that primarily sells our software to other businesses, unfortunately, what I've seen is that many organizations are solving it by asking their vendors to provide checklists and spreadsheets of software dependencies that are actually then never reviewed, or very basic questionnaires that are becoming increasingly long on security controls that never get assessed or are really not practical. And so I empathize that is a step towards doing more, but a lot of it has felt like the initial reaction is let's create more paperwork for the purposes of risk transfer than for actual security. Now, to be clear, and I think as the intent of the creators of the drive for SBOMs, like there is absolute value in automated standards-based systems exchangeable SBOMs for everything from discovering your attack surface to responding quickly when there's incidents. But we have to get much better at how we contextualize and prioritize security risks before organizations rush to add another source of vulnerability information to developers. Back in the early days of vulnerability management, we used to flood system administrators with terrible vulnerability scan reports once a quarter full of false positives. And at least it was once a quarter so they could sift through the findings and select what they were going to ignore. But if you're looking at engineering and DevOps teams that are doing daily build and release, you can't flood them with low quality security signals on a constant basis. It's unsustainable, and it just erodes trust between security and engineering, which then inhibits progress against things that actually do matter. You need context, you need prioritization, especially when building for the cloud. Like the rate of change really makes that more important than ever. And so I think for organizations like grappling with how do they use SBOM data effectively, it goes back to a more fundamental question of, do you have tooling in place to adequately prioritize and focus your developers' efforts on the security fixes that are going to matter? And if the answer is no today, even for other sources of vulnerability data, then throwing SBOM data in the pile may not necessarily solve anything. And so there's potentially like baby steps you need to work through before getting to that.
Thank you. One question, like to finalize the discussion, what are you most optimistic about in cybersecurity, especially going into 2023?
And it can be hard to be optimistic, right? Like, especially I've been in industry so long, and it's easy to sort of get just beaten down by the incident after incident and bad news after bad news. But there's a lot of things that if you really look back on, like we've made great progress. So to name a couple, one, I think we have proven that we can eliminate entire categories of attack or entire attack surfaces by building secure design platforms and then investing in their usability to the point where the intrinsic trade-offs of using those platforms are generally acceptable to the masses. So, if you look at iOS or Chrome OS, there really has never been a mass malware outbreak impacting any of those platforms because of a lot of the keen design decisions they've made. They haven't been perfect, but compared to the computing platforms that preceded it, it's a massive, massive change. Another example, I remember in my early days of incident response, the most common financial crime type attack you deal with is massive cardholder data theft, either at retailers or processors. When's the last time there was a massive cardholder data theft incident? It doesn't happen anymore because we moved towards secure processes and protocols that make cardholder data no longer a viable and useful thing for attackers to steal. So I think, again, like it takes a lot of investment and time, but it's great to see that we can move forward. I'll also say that I think we're in an era where observability is better than it's ever been. Nearly every major computing platform, maybe save for mobile, but true for endpoints, true for cloud services, are built with phenomenal security telemetry, like more than we ever hoped to have a decade ago. More than people can actually even use, which is both a good problem to have, but a challenge. And so I think we're still learning as vendors, as defenders, to operationalize telemetry in better and better ways. The fact that we're building faster and faster means we're creating more sources of signal as fast as we're expanding the range of signal we collect from any given resource. And so keeping pace with that means finding programmatic ways to use that data in a scalable, automated way to not just inform detection and after the fact work, but also to inform prevention. And so it's phenomenal to have that observability data and also a great opportunity to continue building on it.
Ryan, thank you so much for your thoughts and for your advice. I'm looking forward to a secure year in 2023. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wiz is on a mission to help every organization rapidly identify and remove critical risks in their cloud environments. Purpose-built for the cloud, Wiz delivers full-stack visibility, accurate risk prioritization, and enhanced business agility. Wiz connects in minutes using an agentless approach that scans both platform configurations and inside every workload. We perform a deep assessment that goes beyond what standalone CSPM and CWPP tools offer to find the toxic combination of flaws that represent real risk. To learn more about Wiz, please visit securityweekly.com/Wiz.